Hello, I'm Bill Barry. Welcome to a look back at the origin and early history of Naugatuck, Connecticut. Time prohibits us from exploring every detail of these historical events, but we will see the effects of rapid industrial growth and meet early town figures whose pioneering spirit and architectural legacy have made the borough unique in the landscape of Connecticut. Shortly after the first white settlers settled on the east side of the Naugatuck River in 1702, the area became known as Judd's Meadow. Well, that's because the only decent land for grazing, the west side of the river, was used by a man named Judd.
Judd, who was a prominent man in Waterbury, a deacon of the church and so forth, had the rights to graze his cattle here, so it became, the area became known as Judd's Meadows. And that term continued until about 1752, when the first bridge was built across the river.
About 1752, the area known as Judd's Meadow was changed to Salem Bridge, which was taken from a well-known term coming from the Hebrew, shalom.
Of course, in Connecticut in those days, the Congregational Church was the dominant force, and most of the citizens were members of the Congregational Church in those days, and they did not like having to go to Waterbury for services, because the 5 or 6 miles was a long ways in the winter time by walking or by horse, and not too many people had horses. So in 1752, they petitioned the legislature, who took care of establishing parishes and so on, for a separate parish called the Salem Ecclesiastical Society. And because there was a bridge, somehow that name got applied to the area, Salem Bridge.
The name Salem Bridge was abandoned, and the town was incorporated in 1844. There was an establishment in central Connecticut called Salem, and the similarity caused great confusion to the rapidly developing postal system. Ultimately, the name Naugatuck was chosen because of the river. Exactly what the word Naugatuck means is difficult to uncover because of its Indian origins. Some say one big tree. Some say the tree by the river where the fishing was good.
This is unusual because in Connecticut you don't find towns with Indian names. You find rivers, but not towns. Towns generally had biblical names or were named after towns in Britain. So Naugatuck has a kind of uniqueness in that respect.
Naugatuck's early development was little affected by the Revolutionary War, although some Naugatuck citizens were said to have enlisted.
Washington came through this area, though it's questionable whether he ever stayed here. Some of his men stayed at the Porter Inn, which is now still standing in Union City.
This inn was located on the Litchfield Turnpike. In those days, the Turnpike was a very important road in Connecticut because it came up from New Haven.
The coaches and so forth that traveled between between New Haven and Litchfield used to come through here. You had to pay a toll up near where the dam now is.
Naugatuck's location was favorable to small-scale manufacturing. Naugatuck was also naturally endowed with 4 brooks, which provided water power for factories.
It at first seemed like it might be a possibly good farming area because of the flat area, but being glacial soil, since the glacier came down and deposited loads of rocks in this area, it turned out to be very poor from an agricultural standpoint. That meant that the people here had to find other means of survival.
Small shops that didn't require sophisticated manufacturing procedures grew up. These shops made Yankee notions, little items that households needed, like buttons, combs, and knives. One of the earliest of these enterprises was located on Fulling Mill Brook.
Fulling Mill Brook, which is in the Union City part of Naugatuck, coming down from Prospect, had fairly good pitch to it, so that it provided a fairly good supply of water and ran a lot of water wheels. At first, mainly, it's called Fulling Mill Brook. It was first used in a fulling mill, which is a mill to take woven cloth, which was done at home usually, and raise a nap on it.
Gradually, other products were developed. Cutlery and other things were manufactured in small wooden shops with overshot water wheels. The river was dammed in 1824 so water could run down the west side toward what is called Water Street. That's the area where Silas Greeley made buttons, and a few years later, Sylvester and Heman Clark manufactured high-grade brass clocks. There was a clock enterprise out on what is now Rubber Avenue, and another on Elm Street run by the Wards. But since the business was not tremendous, they diversified into curtain hardware and doorknobs. About this time, Charles Goodyear was beginning to experiment with rubber.
It was actually about 1839 when Charles Goodyear began to process money and obtained some money from the Lewis family to get started. He had learned to vulcanize rubber, and that made it useful for many things. Prior to that, they really didn't know what it was good for. And he didn't have the money to carry the enterprise on, and unfortunately, the financing of it in later years was done by people in New York, New Jersey, and so forth, so he lost control of it.
The making of farm implements, hoes, rakes, and plows was another important enterprise in the early days. Eben Tuttle invented the gooseneck hoe, which used a spring steel piece to prevent shoulder shock.
By the mid-1850s, they were producing thousands of hoes and rakes and other farm implements down in the south end of town. Bronson
Tuttle, Eben's son, became very interested in malleable iron and encouraged his father to invest money in the process. In 1858, they built a foundry. At the same time, John Howard Whittemore was working as a railroad clerk at the Union City Station across from the Tuttle Foundry. Whittemore and Tuttle struck up a friendship, which soon became a business arrangement.
I think Whittemore was about 18 at that time. Tuttle was about 20. Decided that he would be a big asset to his malleable iron venture and took him in on the business end of it. And very soon he realized he was such an asset he would make a good partner. So he offered him a partnership for $500. Whittemore didn't have $500, but he borrowed it from the Bull family in Woodbury and became a partner, and they were successful right from the start.
Railroads were expanding all over the United States. The rails were attached to the ties with fish plates made of malleable iron. Whittemore and Tuttle got many large orders for these.
Then the Civil War came along and required things like grenade housings, which they made in large numbers. And by the time the Civil War was over, they were both very well off.
The Civil War didn't affect the average person, though a good number of Naugatuck soldiers served. It did change the economic picture, and people tried to contribute what they could.
Of course, during the Civil War, cotton became very scarce, so that every piece of cotton that could be reclaimed was. And the pews in the old Congregational Church on the Green were stuffed with cotton, the cushions. They took the cushions apart and removed all the cotton and stuffed them with things like corn husks and whatnot, which were not strategic, simply to loosen up these things that could be used because, of course, soldiers had to be provided with uniforms, with blankets, with things of that sort.
After the war, changes took place on a variety of fronts. One of the most dramatic changes over the course of several years was the diversification of the population. The early settlers were originally Yankees from the Farmington-Waterbury area. In the 1840s, after the failure of the potato crop in Ireland, there was a heavy influx of Irish immigrants, so that by 1860, Naugatuck was about 1/3 Irish.
There was only one Italian here in 1877 when Mr. Spencer took a census house to house. But Swedes began coming in the 1880s, mainly looking for domestic work and working in the foundry. Then later there were Poles, Italians, Lithuanians, and other groups which tended to settle in those parts of the town where there were people of their own background. So that we had a section in the northwest part of the town called Swede Hill. We had Little Italy in the southeastern part. We had many Irish in the southwestern part. We had many Poles and others from that portion of Europe in the so-called Union City area. And it used to be that you could tell by their name probably where they lived, what church they went to, what school they attended.
The railroad continued to expand and was a catalyst for growth during the late 1840s and 1850s. It made it much easier to bring raw materials to the foundries and other Naugatuck industries, and also to ship goods from the town. Naturally, Naugatuck's industrialization meant more jobs, which ensured that the community would continue to grow. In those days, the families spent more time together, perhaps because of the lack of other organized activities. Community events like commencements, plays, and school exhibitions were held in places like Nichols Hall on South Main Street.
There were no theaters until the town hall was built in 1882, and the upper story of that provided facilities for a so-called opera house. Then the parish house was completed near the Congregational Church in 1888, and that was built to provide a kind of civic center for events for all the people in town.
The location of the parish house near the Congregational and Episcopal churches made that part of the green a focal point in the community. The importance of this area was one reason why the Civil War monument was erected there.
It was felt, as in most towns, that there should be a suitable memorial for those who fought in the Civil War. And so funds were raised by public subscription and other means. There were many contributors to put up a suitable monument, and it was felt the green was the ideal location for this, since that was sort of the community center.
Naugatuck, not unlike most of the other towns in the area, was largely a manufacturing town. But J.H. Whittemore and Bronson Tuttle had a different vision.
They were both very civic-minded people. They were very interested in the town. Whittemore, coming from a church family, where his father was a well-educated clergyman, was very interested in classical education, architecture, and things of that sort. Became friendly with Stamford White and the firm of McKim, Mead, and White, who were then the leading architects in America. And as a result, they hired McKim, Mead, and White to do many things in the way of building in Naugatuck.
As a matter of fact, when Whittemore's son died at about age 15, his father wanted a fitting memorial, so he hired McKim, Mead, and White to design a library with classical lines, beautiful entranceway, tile floor, and dome with recessed decorated panels. Whittemore also had a deep interest in education. When it was decided that the Union District School, including the high school, which was on the top floor, was becoming obsolete and inadequate, he again commissioned his favorite architects to design the Salem School, and in later years, a new high school, which is now the Hillside School.
He commissioned McKim, Mead, and White to design what is known as Salem School, across from the Green. And that in its day was one of the finest grammar schools built in the country. It was so designed no classrooms were adjacent to each other, so that what went on in one classroom could not disturb another. There were big spacious halls, staircases. Then later, the high school, which was on the top floor of that building, was found to be inadequate, so McKim, Mead, and White were hired to design a new high school, which now is Hillside School, the middle school. And he wanted it so that it would appear downtown from the Green in a nice setting. So he made a deal with Mr. Schaefer, who was one of the officials at the rubber company, to acquire his house and have it moved so that the high school could be built on that site. And they developed the concept of an interesting building, and you might say unique, in that the road went around the building so that all 3 stories have street entrances. That is, I think, the only school building so built. And it was a beautiful building of granite, brick with classical columns, and a quotation cut in the granite by Dr. Eliot, the president of Harvard, about the fruit of a liberal education. This you see when you go up the granite stairs approaching that building, and was thought to be an inspiration for the students who attended there.
Whittemore and Tuttle also built fine homes. Bronson Tuttle built his home in the late 1870s. He hired the architect Robert Hill from Waterbury to design his mansion, which is now the education headquarters. The project took 2 years to build because so much of it was custom-made. In order to construct his 39-room home, John Howard Whittemore moved the Spencer House and later rerouted the railroad.
So the railroad was run up parallel to Church Street, but a little distance from it. It crossed Maple Street, and the railroad station, which was a wooden building, was built not far from where the present firehouse is. When Whittemore decided to build his house there and develop that land, he didn't like the railroad so close to the house. And being on the board of the New Haven Railroad, which then owned that railroad section, he decided to have the tracks move down toward the river. He then moved some houses and put Cedar Street through, so you had a kind of vista approach to the railroad station, which was quite a distinctive building.
Whittemore hired Henry Bacon, a very distinguished architect who designed the Lincoln Memorial, among other things, to build the rail station. Whittemore's mansion was completed in the late 1880s. Unfortunately, this town treasure was lost in a fire on October 9th, 1972.
But I do think the attempt of Mr. Whittemore to have the primary architectural firm in America design buildings for Naugatuck does give it a kind of unique quality in that we have a number of fine buildings, not only this building, the library, but the Congregational Church across the street, the 2 schools, the Hopbrook School by Theodate Pope Riddle, give it a kind of distinct quality. And while other towns in the valley have some fine buildings, Naugatuck, for a town its size, has an amazing concentration of them.
As Naugatuck headed into the 20th century, it would experience growth and change at an unprecedented rate. However, with its historical wealth and architectural inheritance, modern Naugatuck's past will never be too far away.